we're doing this as a presentation recall of the November 15th SAF meeting for the professional society. And so there's two motives behind this. And one is the foresters are fundamentally involved with atmosphere and climate. We've been creating influences across the atmosphere and climate for a long, long time. But this is an opportunity to take that kind of involvement to the next level. Point two is that foresters ought to become hopefully effectively knowledgeable about the climate and atmosphere and so on, so as to be able to be influential in this big picture. This session is the first ever to bring this scope into the SAF orbit. And as such, this is a new avenue practically of expertise. Interestingly, very much, the presentation a week after this by Lauren Scott, a very renowned economist and so on in Louisiana, the last third of his presentation got into this subject in a big way, and practically was, you would call it a hand in glove with Terry's presentation. Furthermore, the timing of this ties in exactly with the climate fracas circus over in Glasgow, Scotland, which had been going on for a couple of weeks. So getting to our presenter, Mr. Terry Ciccone, he's been involved deeply in climate science after an extremely notable large-scale career in heavy industry, and as is described in the accompanying backgrounder, that's a resume short presentation, and which was presented at the background for the SAF meeting. We'll begin with a 5-minute introduction by Steve Coleman, and then we'll phase into Terry's presentation.
Hubris is a Greek word that means dangerously overconfident. Based on my research, hubris fairly describes our current response to the issue of climate change. Here's what many people believe. 1, the planet is warming catastrophically because of certain human behaviors. 2, thanks to powerful computers, we can project what the climate will be like 20, 40, or even 100 years from now. And 3, that if we eliminate just one behavior, the burning of fossil fuels, we can prevent the climate from changing for as long as we like. Each of these presumptions, together the basis of our hubris regarding the changing climate, is either untrue or so far off the mark as to be useless. Yes, it's true that the globe is warming, and that humans are exerting a warming influence upon it. But beyond that, to paraphrase a line from the classic movie, The Princess Bride, I do not think the science says what you think it says. For example, government reports state clearly that heat waves in the US are now no more common than they were in 1900. Hurricane activity is no different than it was a century ago. Floods have not increased across the globe over more than 70 years. Greenland's ice sheet isn't shrinking any more rapidly today than it was 80 years ago. Why aren't these reassuring facts better known? Because the public gets its climate information almost exclusively from the media. And from a media perspective, fear sells. Things aren't that bad doesn't sell. Very few people, and that includes journalists who report on climate news, read the actual science. I have. And what the data, the hard science from the US government and the UN climate report say is that things aren't that bad. Nor does the public understand the questionable basis of all catastrophic climate change projections, computer modeling. Projecting future climate is excruciatingly difficult. Yes, there are human influences, but the climate is complex. Anyone who says that climate models are just physics either doesn't understand them or is being deliberately misleading. I should know, I wrote one of the first textbooks on computer modeling. While modelers base their assumptions upon both fundamental physical laws and observations of the climate, there's still considerable judgment involved. And since different modelers will make different assumptions, results vary widely among different models. Let's just take one simple but significant assumption modelers must make: the impact of clouds on the climate. Natural fluctuations in the height and coverage of clouds have at least as much of an impact on the flows of sunlight and heat as do human influences. But how can we possibly know global cloud coverage, say 10, let alone 50 years from now? Obviously, we can't. But to create a climate model, we have to make assumptions. That's a pretty shaky foundation on which to transform the world's economy. And by the way, creating more accurate models isn't getting any easier. In fact, the more we learn about the climate system, the more we realize how complex it is. Rather than admit this complexity, the media, the politicians, and a good portion of the climate science community attribute every terrible storm, every flood, every major fire to climate change. Yes, we've always had these weather events in the past, the narrative goes, but somehow climate change is making everything worse. Even if that were true, isn't the relevant question, how much worse? Not to mention that worse is not exactly a scientific term. And how would we make it better? For the alarmists, that's easy. We get rid of fossil fuels. Not only is this impractical, we get over 80% of the world's energy from fossil fuels. It's not scientifically possible. That's because CO2 doesn't disappear from the atmosphere in a few days like, say, smog. It hangs around for a really long time. About 60% of any CO2 that we emit today will remain in the atmosphere 20 years from now. Between 30 and 55% will still be there after a century, and between 15 and 30% will remain after 1,000 years. In other words, it takes centuries for the excess carbon dioxide to vanish from the atmosphere. And so any partial reduction in carbon dioxide emissions would only slow the increase in human influences, not prevent it, let alone reverse it. CO2 is not a knob that we can just turn down to fix everything. We don't have that ability. To think that we do is, well, hubris. Hubris leads to bad decisions. A little humility and a little knowledge would lead to better ones. I'm Steve Coonan, former Undersecretary for Science in the Obama administration and author of Unsettled: What Climate Science Tells Us, What It Doesn't, and Why It Matters, for Prager University.
Ladies and gentlemen of the Society of American Foresters, I'm honored to be here. Thank you for the invitation. My name is HUBRIS Ciccone, author of the book, A Hitchhiker's Journey Through Climate Change. And today we're going to have a brief discussion about climate change. Now, there are many dimensions on this subject, which are at the forefront of so many discussions and debates. The scary headlines that we see each day, the political posturing of this political party or by that candidate, the doom and gloom predictions. But no, we're going to discuss today about the science of climate change and do it in very simple words and concepts that we can all relate to in our daily lives and practical world experience. I trust Bill Weiger here will yank on my leash and recenter me if I go off too deeply into the scientific minutiae. I hope you found the Prager University video startling and shocking, as it deviates so much from what we are told each day by the press and the media and the politicians. We are not in time of humanitarian crisis. To the contrary, the earth and humanity have never been in a better place at any point in history. So there's been a circus up in Scotland for these past several weeks, and everything that we hear from them says doom, gloom, and burn. And the truth of the matter is that the earth is in a great, great place. The population worldwide has never been healthier or wealthier, and the population growth is moderating. The high temperatures of the 1980s through the 1990s, they've started coming down since the year 2000 and are stabilizing at a slow pace. And the earth is greening like crazy from the abundance of CO2. The food production is at an all-time high, not just for humanity, but all of wildlife. And yes, the ice sheets of Antarctica and Greenland have been growing now for the past half a decade. But we have some near-term challenges that we need to face. First and foremost is the widespread misinformation about CO2 climate change catastrophe. There's no such thing going on. And we're going to get into the science of why I can say that. The second is human greed and global ignorance about the real science of climate change. So the message here is that no, there is no climate change crisis. We only have a misinformation climate crisis. Now, CO2 is essentially a fertilizer for all plants, whether it's the grasses or the trees or the cornfields. It is like fertilizer, and it's happening worldwide. And it's especially been beneficial in the semi-arid locations. Recall that with high levels of CO2 in the atmosphere, plants can thrive with up to 70% less water. And that means more food production for all of Earth's creatures. NASA did a 35-year study, and it showed that the increase of CO2 in the last 50, 60 years has increased the greening by the equivalent area of 2 times the United States. And laboratory tests confirm that this growth has been because of more CO2 and no other factors like temperature or rainfall. As far as humans and CO2, we are passengers on the climate change bus. We are not the driver. The lie that never dies. Here we see a reconstruction of the famous hockey curve made famous by Michael Mann. What I'd like to point out on this is that this is a manufactured temperature profile. It is made up of 3 different data sets. From about 1,000 to about 1,500 years ago, it was made up of 1 set of data from tree rings. Then for the next 300-400 years, there's a totally different tree ring data from a different part of the world, different trees, different environments. And then when they tried to use the tree ring data for the last part of the curve, it was not behaving as they wanted to behave because the temperature was showing as coming down. So rather than use tree ring data consistently, for the last 60 years, they spliced in actual thermometer readings because they showed a higher temperature, which they wanted. Now, they hid that from the public because if we use only the thermometer readings, it would show the unreliability of the previous tree ring data. And this was the entire premise of the 2009 scandal that came to be called the Climate Gate. There is a gentleman, his name is Joseph Dalio, and he wrote a fantastic article. Actually, it's 200 pages long, where he does a very detailed analysis how NASA, NOAA, and their counterparts in England conspired to shape that temperature curve to match the CO2 levels. So the takeaway is the hockey stick is not science. It was outright science fraud. Now, what does the geologic record tell us about the relationship between temperature and carbon dioxide over the last 600 million years? That's about as far back as we can reach. What we see here on the blue curve running horizontally is that the Earth's tendency for about the last 550 million years tends to be centered at a temperature that is 23 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than what we call normal today. Think about how hot that is. However, during that period of time, it's been interrupted by severe temperature falls, the first of which was about 450 million years ago. Scientists are pretty certain that that was caused by cosmic rays from an exploding star that went supernova. And it covered the Earth with a lot of cosmic rays and dust and debris, and basically shrouded the Earth from the energy arriving from the sun. And after a while, it cleared up. And then we had another major event centered at its worst at about 300 million years ago. This was the Cambrian extinction, when about 97% of all life in the oceans and about 75% of all vertebrate on lands went extinct. It was a period of extreme cold. And then we see the temperatures go back up, take a dip about 150 million years ago, and then it went back up. But look what happened in the last 50 million years. That temperature has been slowly coming down and down and down to the point where we are today, a little bit above 10 degrees C. Alongside with that, you see there's a black line. That's the level of CO2. And you can see that there's absolutely no correlation between carbon dioxide and temperature. In fact, what we see from about 500 million years ago until about 300 million years ago, the trees are sequestering carbon dioxide out of the air. The trees would grow like crazy because there's so much carbon dioxide in the air. And then, unfortunately, nature had not yet invented the bacteria that breaks down the woody material, release the CO2, release the methane back into the atmosphere. So all that debris kept piling up, and over the centuries became what we call today coal. And then we see around 300 million years ago, CO2 levels were dangerously low to the extinction point. At about 150 ppm, parts per million of carbon dioxide in the air, plant photosynthesis stops. And that will be the end of all life on Earth if we ever reach 150 ppm. And it'll never come back. Fortunately, about 275 million years ago, the Earth's basaltic volcanoes came very much to life. It raised the temperature over a very short time back up to its normal level. And look at the black line. Those volcanoes also replenished the carbon dioxide in the air. And then we see it start to get sequestered again until around 175 million years ago. And then we had another round of very active basaltic volcanoes. These are the volcanoes that broke apart Pangaea and formed the continents that we have today. But as soon as the carbon dioxide in the air was replenished, there we see our little clams and oysters and lobsters sequestering the carbon dioxide, using it to manufacture their shells, which eventually become rocks. And in fact, if you look at the Alps in Europe, are almost 100% manufactured by the carbon dioxide-based rocks. So here we see the temperatures of the last 4,500 years. What we see is a cyclic period of warming and cooling, averaging somewhere between 700 and 1,000 years. So when the alarmists tell you that we are at historic level, that is not true. For example, around 1100, from about 900 to about 1200 years ago, it was so warm on Earth that the Vikings went and actually settled in Greenland and had a thriving villages and economies there and agriculture for about 400 years. And then they got cold again in the what we call the Little Ice Age. That Little Ice Age shows the temperature as the coldest the Earth has been in the last 10,000 years. So that is the temperature profile. The other thing we see is that every time we have a warm period, we have an advancement in civilization, science, art, culture. And every time we've had the cold, it's been misery and ignorance and war and pestilence as people fight over the limited resources of food primarily. On the right bottom there, you see, compare that with the reconstructed Hokey Pokey Hansen record, and you can see how different that is from the actual recordings from consistent data. The fudging of historical temperature record I mentioned a little bit sooner, and here we have evidence using NOAA's actual recordings. In the light blue, in the dark blue line on that graph is a record of the temperatures as they were recorded on the day the temperature was measured. And you can see that since 1890, the highest temperature period was in the late 1930s. Many of us remember that as the Dust Bowl days, made famous in the book and movie, The Grapes of Wrath. And however, over the last 25 years, NOAA has been adjusting those temperatures for whatever reason. And now we see how that temperature has been adjusted. It's been adjusted to show a trend, a rising trend in temperatures from the early 1900s up to today. Effectively, they've eliminated the high temperatures of the 30s. Why did they want to show the sharp increase in temperature? Because it was made to match the increasing CO2 level in the atmosphere. So again, I recommend that you read the book, Surface Temperature Records by Joseph Dalio and Anthony Watts. They will show you the forensic behind how that data was manipulated and how many thousands of hours of manpower it took to carry it out. In this chart here, we see the temperature record of the Earth as measured by the satellites, which starts in 1979. And here we see three vital points. On the left, you see the rising temperatures from 1979 until 1998. The reason for that increase in temperature is because the sun was very magnetically active. Then around 1998, the solar activity has started to decline. And in the yellow line, what we see is a very fast drop in temperature until about 2008, almost wiping out all of the gains in temperature of the preceding 30 years. And then starting in 2008, while the solar temperature is decreasing, we see the global temperatures going up. So what's going on here? What's going on, what has been going on since 1979 is there's also been increasing volcanic activity on the Earth. And we use here the El Nino effect because the El Ninos are a powerful contributor to the global temperature. So each one of these spikes, like we see in 1989 and in 1998 and in 2011 and in 2017 and in 2019 and 20, the global temperature was increased tremendously by the El Ninos, which are powered by the tectonic, the volcanic activity centered in the Earth's core. I place a lot of importance on volcanic activity as a significant contributor to the global warming that we've experienced since the 1960s. In the top left graph is one source of volcanic activity, and you can see how rapidly it has increased since 1850, and especially note the 1980s and the high volcanic activity of 2000 and 2010. These are the average number of volcanic eruptions per decade. Of course, these are only the land-based volcanoes. On the bottom chart is a different measure, this one from the Smithsonian Institute. And it's amazing to see how this chart has been manipulated. According to NASA and NOAA, they state that volcanic activity is not a significant determinant in climate change because they say, well, volcanic activity hasn't changed in the last 150 years. Basically, what they're doing is they're looking at that bottom blue line on the chart. These are the major volcanic eruptions that have more than 1/10 of a cubic meter of affluence, material blown out. But look at the red chart, which is all eruptions. So there's been a huge increase in the number of smaller eruptions, the eruptions that are not measured and totally ignored by NASA and NOAA in making their climate change projections. Now, there are two fundamental types of volcanoes. The explosive volcanoes are the ones that have a lot of silicon content in their lava. These explode, and these are the ones we are shown on television, the Mount St. Helena or the Mount Pinatubo. They take a mountain and blow it up, sending debris up into the stratosphere, 20, 25, 30 kilometers up in the sky. And what they do is they form aerosols and dust and causes more of the sunlight to be reflected to outer space and therefore cooling the Earth. The ones that we are not familiar with are the basaltic flow volcanoes, like the one shown in the picture here. These are like cauldrons. The lava just keeps boiling up and up and up. Sometimes it may shoot a fountain up 10, 15, 20 feet, but most of the time, the lava just oozes out. And this oozing lava adds tremendous amounts of heat. The other major point that I want to make is that it's estimated that up to 85% of all volcanic activities are under the oceans and under glaciers, where people don't know them. We scientists don't even know how to measure their strengths. So the takeaway is that volcanic activity, tectonic activity, these vents that are countless all over the world, under the oceans, under glaciers, have been a major factor in the warming of the earth in the last 140, 150 years. So what's the climate forecast for the next 25 to 40 years? And here we look primarily to the activities of the sun. The sun has these 11-year cycles that they go through. Sometimes they're more powerful, sometimes they're very weak. So for example, if we look at the top chart, you say there's a place that says really bad. Well, that was the Maunder minimum. That was the coldest temperatures in the last 10,000 years on Earth. And the line represents the power of the solar activity, and it's measured in electrical watts per square meter of area on Earth. And there you can see it going up, and around the year 2000 and just before 2000, you see the high temperatures that we've been experiencing because the sun has been so much more active. But if you look at where we are now, you are here, we are now on what's called the grand solar minimum. That means the sun is going to go to sleep for a while. That's NASA's word. They call it a lazy sun. And right now, it looks, based on the Zarkova forecast, it looks like that this decreased solar activity is likely to continue for the next 30 to 40 years. So we are going to see a steady decline in temperatures, but I don't expect it to be as bad as it was in the 1600s and early 1700s. I expect global temperatures to come down by about 0.5 degree centigrade based on the reduced solar power. Just a word to let you know how bad it really was during the Maunder minimum. About 1/3 of the population of the Northern Hemisphere died, and they died mostly because of starvations due to repeated annual crop failures. And historical data also confirms that this would happen not just in the Northern Hemisphere, but also throughout the Southern Hemisphere too. And so we have now started this cooling period, and it started around 2019. And since then, we saw significant snowstorms in the Sahara Desert, and the ice sheets in Antarctica and Greenland are growing again. And this past Antarctic winter was the second coldest 3-month period ever recorded there. So if we look only at the solar effect, we could be back into the very cold weather of the Maunder minimum, but it appears that the volcanic activity is going to continue, and therefore it'll mitigate the coldness, and perhaps we'll only see temperatures come down by 1/4 degree centigrade instead of 1/2 or more. The science says CO2 warming is not happening. There is no laboratory test. There is no record in the history that can put a cause and effect relationship between CO2 and warming. So we have this climate change myth. So what's that all about? Well, first of all, the climate change myth rewards the advocates of the myth. And these are the universities and the professors. For example, the US government awards about $20 billion last year to various universities and professors to carry out these studies with grants and experiments and what have you. And the industry benefits because they get to sell their solar panels and the windmills, and the politicians benefit because they harvest votes based on their plans to save the planet, and the media because they get all the headlines and the clicks. However, that's impoverishing the working poor and the middle class, because these are the people that have to pay for the subsidies for wind and solar. We also get increased fuel prices. Look at the gasoline prices. It's gone up by 50, 60% in less than a year. And we also get the increased prices of everything, because everything depends on the cost of fuels. And yes, increased blackouts. So we get to pay more and have less energy security. So here's a perfect example of the fake science. We are told about the greenhouse effect. Greenhouse effect many times and over again. On the top left, you see how a real physical greenhouse works. The greenhouse has glass walls all around, and it has a glass roof. This glass enclosure prevents the conduction, the convection, and the latent heat that the sun provides us from escaping into the atmosphere. So it encloses this, and then at night, once there's no longer sunshine, it gradually cools through conduction along the walls and the roof, and it slowly cools during the night. But during the day, the natural process of convection heating, conduction heating, and latent heating is stopped. And that's why a real greenhouse works. Whereas the delusional greenhouse effect does not have any walls, does not have any roof. CO2 does not form the blanket that keeps that heat in. It absolutely is open to the environment. The wind blows in and the heat gets dispersed. There's no such thing as a greenhouse effect or CO2 blanket. Here's another climate change fast fact. The atmosphere is not warmed by CO2 combined with radiation. The atmosphere is warmed primarily by the sun's powerful UV rays. These are the very high energy rays that come from the sun. If we look at the right, on a typical molecule that makes up about 99% of all the gases in the atmosphere are made up by nitrogen and oxygen. So when the powerful UV rays come in and look at the top oxygen atom, you see there's something called a molecular bond. When this molecule made up of two atoms of oxygen gets blasted by one of these UV rays, you see those molecular bonds, they're like rubber bands that hold the two atoms together. They start to vibrate very, very hard. And if it gets hit hard enough, those bonds will break. When those bonds break, those two atoms of oxygen shoot out like bullets in all sorts of random directions. And they travel at very, very high speed with a lot of kinetic energy. Those atoms will crash into stuff in the atmosphere. They'll crash into other molecules of oxygen or nitrogen or carbon dioxide. And when they collide, that's when the heat, the kinetic heat, transforms to thermal heat. So it's the collision of these broken up atoms, broken up molecules that causes the atmosphere to heat. Now, the atmosphere is also heated by the heat that's absorbed by the soil. And we'll get into that a little bit later. But the vast majority of the heating of the atmospheres is done by the ultraviolet and nothing by the CO2. Here I have a little picture of one of those molecules of oxygen, and you see the bond between them. When it gets blasted by a ray, the energy level increases and the vibration level increase. So in this bottom picture, you can see that as also being a carbon dioxide molecule. When they get hit, the infrared radiation is not powerful enough to break those bonds. So it makes them vibrate a little bit higher with higher amplitude, but it's not strong enough to break. So you never generate the kinetic energy that results in the heating. Instead, what the carbon dioxide molecule will do, after a second or half a second from time it gets it absorbs the photon, it emits another one, and then it goes back to the lower state, yellow arrow. Another very important factor is that in 2011, NOAA told the Scientific American magazine and the Journal of Earth Geoscience that the Earth's nuclear furnace, meaning the volcanic activity that I've mentioned so much, provides as much energy to warming the Earth as is done by the sun. Whereas in all of the Earth's energy budget presented to us by the alarmists, they only count the sun as the only source of heat. And to use that as an example, I had a wine cellar built deep underground, and year round, the temperature in there was about 55 degree F. In the summer, it might have been 56 or 57. In the wintertime, it might have been 52 or 53. The point is that absent the sun, the temperature in my wine cellar rarely changed significantly from winter to summer, from day to night. So that is Earth generating its own heat in its own nuclear furnace and providing a great deal of energy that NASA and NOAA never even bother to talk about. So, number one, there's no such thing as radiative forcing of CO2 molecules. That is a political construct, that's not science. And secondly, there is no such thing as a greenhouse effect. I'll just go through this very, very briefly to highlight a few more scientific facts. On the left there, you see the big cube that represents 2,500 molecules of air. And out of that, only one is CO2. So if you think that one red CO2 molecule can warm the other 2,500 molecules around it, That's just not going to happen. That doesn't pass the common sense test. On the left over here, on the right, we see 5 molecules of air. According to their theory, this one little green molecule gets blasted by an infrared radiation, and supposedly it warms up the other 4 molecules, but that's not what happens, because within a tiny fraction of a second from the time that green arrow absorbs the infrared radiation, it radiates it back out, and it goes back to its low energy state. The last one I want to highlight on this page is this middle picture called saturation. We've been told that a doubling of CO2 will cause the planet to cook, but that's not possible, because if we look on the left where it says saturation, the radiation coming off of the Earth is already 100% is already captured by the existing CO2, and most of that is captured within the first 10 meters of elevation from the Earth up. In other words, there's already enough CO2 molecules there to capture 100% of the radiation heat coming up from the Earth. So if we double the CO2, well, what do? It gets captured even at a lower range. So it's science fakery. You double CO2, there might be a tiny fraction increase in heating, but nothing that's measurable or worth noting. So here's the summary against the CO2 caused global warming. We have the common sense item like solution. You cannot use one CO2 molecule to heat another 2,500 air molecules with any significant effect. And I used the wine cellar experiment to demonstrate that the Earth's nuclear furnace is already providing a huge amount of heat into the atmosphere, which is totally unaccounted for in the NASA and NOAA energy budget. Today, we have about 420 ppm of CO2 in the atmosphere. But we know through the Heinz-Hug experiment that the first 200 to 300 ppm already captures 100% of all available radiation, what they call the bounce back radiation. So if you double the CO2, makes no difference. You quadruple it, no significant temperature increase. And then we saw the difference between the real greenhouses versus the phony greenhouse effect. The other thing is the greenhouse effect violates the second law of thermodynamics. What does that mean? It means that if I take a cup of hot coffee in my hand, the hot coffee will warm my hands. But my cooler hand cannot warm the hotter cup of coffee. We learned that the radiation is not powerful enough to break the molecular bonds of the carbon dioxide molecules. And lastly, radiative energy is not additive. You cannot take the heat from one 100F brick and add it to the heat of another 100F brick to get a 200-degree F brick. You cannot add radiative energy. And then, of course, we saw the historical temperature record of how temperature and CO2 really have nothing to do with each other. Lastly, Everything is made to sound so scientifically sophisticated by the Stefan Boltzmann equation. The fact of the matter is, once you get into the real mathematics, it is the correct concept, yes, but the Stefan Boltzmann constant is so high that it's laughable. For example, what it would tell me is if I take a meter cube of ice and put it in my kitchen, that cubic meter of ice is going to warm my body up the same as it would be by 3 100-watt light bulbs, which is an absurdity. And lastly, they take no account about the water vapor in the clouds, and that is such a huge, huge factor. Summary and recommendations. Number one, stop the lies. Stop this human-made CO2 greenhouse effect, climate change crisis. There is no such crisis. It's only a grand fabrication to benefit the well-connected, the politically empowered, who support the desired worldview. Climate change crisis is not supported by historical event, nor by science, nor by our daily experiences and common sense. NASA must be held accountable for promoting the climate change fake science, and they must fund studies of the real science of climate change, because it's far from settled. The more we learn about it, the more we see how complex it is. And most importantly, NASA must provide a full explanation of what it meant when it said that the Earth's nuclear furnace, nucleus core, is providing 50% of the planet's heat. And if it is providing the Earth with that much heat, why is it not taking Earth's energy balance? And most importantly, the government stopped subsidizing unreliable, unaffordable wind and solar energy, and stop promoting the end of fossil fuels, because that threatens not only the economies, but the people's wealth and health and well-being. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Terry. Bill, do you have any final comments? And Terry, if you wanted to stop sharing.
Say, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. As I mentioned earlier, this we intend to have on the Louisiana SAF website, along with Terry's backgrounder information. And I forgot to say at the beginning, my name's Bill Wieger, and I currently am the interim chair for the State Society, and was the chair for the annual meeting, and being the connecting person to Terry Ciccone. And this is really such bedrock and useful information for everybody to go forward with. We're very, very fortunate to be able to put it together, and so look forward to being able to access it from the Louisiana Society of American Foresters website. That should do it. And I thank Buck a heck of a lot for piecing us all together. And certainly for Terry. And Terry, your voice held up precisely.
Thank you.
So thanks a lot.